Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's such a pleasure to host you here in Oxford.
Oh, thank you for having me.
No
the weather could have been better. You guys can do better next time, I'm sure.
That's one thing, unfortunately, out of our control. We'll try next time. So I thought kind of today we'd focus mainly around your work in women's rights activism. And I wanted to ask what it was that first inspired you to devote your life to work and fight for gender equality and women's political participation.
So a really easy question right out the gate, like very light first question. I actually was never devoted to it growing up, only because I hadn't necessarily seen a difference in the way I was treated versus I have 5 brothers and I have 5 sisters. So I have a pretty significant kind of pool from which to garner experience from. And growing up, my parents had one hard rule. How many of you are immigrants or the children of immigrants? Yeah. So you guys must be familiar with whoever does the best in school is the best. Okay. So that was the rule in our house. As long as you did well in your education, then you were treated well. You could, if you got a really good mark, you could come home and ask your parents to go to the party, and they're more likely to say yes. Gender almost never came into the mix. And it wasn't until I started medical school, and one of my professors actually said to me that why did I always raise my hand? It's not like I was going to use the degree anyway. It was just going to hang on the wall. And that was probably when I became a lot more attuned to the way people spoke to me. And so medical school, I think, was when it really began to turn around. And I started recognizing that while my voice was heard, it was not heard with the same amount of respect or recognition that a lot of my male classmates and counterparts were.
Mm-hmm. What is it that's kept you motivated when you felt kind of struggle in this fight in your work for gender equality?
Kept me motivated. I have phenomenal reserves of family and friends who are just badass in everything they do. I have incredibly supportive and powerful, just powerful women around me who I think inspire me to do better. And I also, at one point, a couple of years ago, I told a woman that I was not responsible to prove myself. And she laughed at me and she said, yeah, you are. We had to prove ourselves. You have to prove yourself. So the girls after you can prove themselves less and then just be taken based on merit alone. And I think that was also very important to hear. So I think the women I surround myself with have been pretty incredible.
Why do you think it's important that gender equality is put at the forefront of the international discussion kind of surrounding human rights?
I don't just think it's important, I think it's common sense. So I come from a medical background. And when I started looking more at policy, they're 2 fundamentally different worlds. In medicine, you look at what works, what makes the most sense, what costs the least, and what'll give you the best prognosis, and you go for it, right? Policy seems to be much different. And so for me, it was looking at what works. Now, you can pick almost any agenda under the sun. You can look at security, when women are included in how many security processes, how many peace processes last more than 5 years? Who can give me the number? Go ahead, you shout it out.
10%.
Less than 10%. 90% of peace processes fail within 5 years. When women are included, what's the number? How many fail or how many succeed? When women are included, peace processes are 35 times more likely to last 15 years. 15, not 5. 35 times more likely. Now, if you work in policy or you work in security or nation building, you know that 15 years is such a huge window in which you can then engage on increasing economic growth. You can ensure greater education. You can ensure healthcare, right? And the likelihood of long-term conflict decreases, right? That's empirical. You know the numbers. We have the data. We can look at corruption. When 30% of women are included in a governing body, it's less corrupt. We can look at business. More inclusive businesses are more sustainable and more prosperous. We can look at education. When women are educated, they end up returning 90% of their economic dividends into their community, whereas men return 30%. The education of girls would equal the economic growth of China and India combined, right? We can look at the fact that educating girls, education, means that you have a lower population, is the single most cost-effective and practical strategy for climate change, means that women are more likely to vaccinate and treat their children, so you have healthier populations. If you look at healthcare, you know that women's reproductive rights is the second most cost-effective and practical solution to climate change. That's the reality. That's the empirical evidence. It's not me sitting here saying you should respect women, because fundamentally women are human beings and they deserve respect, because that, I think, goes without saying. But it's also the fact that if you're just smart, if you just use a bit of common sense and you're good at governance, then yes, you should have more inclusive security processes. Women should be first and foremost in healthcare. They should be first and foremost in education. They should be first and foremost in climate change action, because it makes sense. Yeah. It makes empirical, financial, political, security sense.
So even though it's been highlighted that this gender inequality is something that's holding society back, I think it'd be fair to say, why do you think the problem still exists? It's not something that's, particular to one region or one culture. It kind of seems to be a very global problem. Why do you think it exists in the way that it does?
So here's the challenge. I don't think it's because we don't know the facts, because we do. I think one of the huge issues is our systems and our structures and our institutions have been built on norms that have been written by one group in society, right? So, and they've been heavily influenced by faith and heavily influenced by culture, but the reality is almost all of our social norms and almost all of our laws have been dictated by men and in the likeness of men. And that's something that we have to be very cognizant of, because until we start talking about ensuring women's roles on every level, everything from, STEM to media and storytelling to religion and culture. And until we start tackling it from every space, you're not going to see much of a shift, because ultimately what's dictated our norms until now have been laws that have been heavily influenced by traditional interpretations.
Yeah. And what role do you think religion can play to promote women's liberation around the world, but also in the Arab world more specifically?
So that's an interesting question, because I think religion is an interesting topic in and of itself. Religion is, at least in my view, I'm sure everybody has their views, but religion is, in my view, it's more or less an empty book, and you give it the interpretation that you want, right? There's writing, and oftentimes we interpret it in our own likeness, which is why the fact that we've had men interpreting it for so long has translated into what I think is a distorted interpretation over time. That's important. And I think that the same power religion holds to promote or to be manipulated and misused to promote hate and insecurity and division can be channeled to promote positive inclusion and respect and cohesion. I think it has both of those functions, and it's really about who's utilizing it, how it's been interpreted, and how it's been deployed, if you will. So I think it has fundamental, and I don't think anyone can disagree that it has incredible amounts of power globally, not just Islam or Christianity, but religion as an ideal has fundamental power. Whether or not it's deployed in the right way is another question.
How do you think we can combat those who kind of use those narratives that may be misinterpreted and wrong?
I think we have to get into the conversation. I mean, one of the biggest challenges, I still remember when I was first starting my NGO, and I said I want to start talking about the misuse and misinterpretation of religion. A lot of people said you shouldn't do that. A lot of people felt, a lot of more liberal people said, oh, you're giving power to religious leaders, which I thought was funny because they have all the power. That's the whole problem. And a lot of conservative people said, well, you can't do that. You're a women's rights organization, and they're going to shame you and talk about your honor, et cetera, which is a fair argument. But I think that we can't, as not just as women, but as society, I mean, there are spheres, and religion is one of them. There are multiple spheres of power. And if we're not engaging in those spheres of power, then we have no control over that conversation. We have no inclusion in that conversation. And if you're not part of that conversation, then those decisions are going to be made for you by other people. And to me, that's been our biggest mistake. So I think women's rights organizations in particular, but human rights organizations and definitely need to get into the state where they start challenging what is being taught to community, not just in a formal educational sense, but what's the cultural interpretation, what's the religious interpretation of these. And I think women in particular can single-handedly transform that conversation. We've seen it happen in Algeria and Morocco, for example, where Murshidat, where women religious leaders have done a phenomenal job in terms of talking about women's health and women's education. And I think that can happen more globally, but we really do need to engage on that level. And we need to be a bit more fearless in that engagement and say, yeah, this is a conversation that we're entitled to have simply by existing in this space.
But for many women, I guess, religion provides something of a support network kind of within their family. How do you think that women in that situation can kind of combat the oppression that they might be facing or might feel that they are potentially facing?
So religion provides a phenomenal support system for me. I'm very proud to be Muslim. I'm very proud of what it's provided for me. I'm very proud of the comfort that I get from it. And I think, so one of the reasons I wanted to become a doctor when I was younger was a lot of people, when I ask them for the most religious place they can name, the most spiritual and holy place, most people will tell me a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a temple. And for me, it was always the hospital. Because I do fundamentally think, and if you think about it, most hospitals, the walls of hospitals have heard more prayers than I would argue any congregation in any faith. And I think for me, that was the religion that I fell in love with. A merciful faith that you could call on at your weakest points, and it has been that for me. And that doesn't make me blind to when religion is misused and manipulated and misinterpreted, but it does allow for me to see the net benefit of engaging in that space. And I think for women and men, who find spiritual and personal comfort in faith, it is only bettered and only enhanced if we start talking about the proper ways in which faith should hold people in their community accountable, or faith should be utilized to ensure prosperous and peaceful societies and cohesive societies. I don't think there's any loss there in starting those conversations. And I think it's like any other conversation. If you don't want to be a part of it, you don't have to, but we need to have it.
But what would your message be to women who feel scared to speak up and speak out?
You're going to have that across any conversation, right? You have that across religious norms. You have that more so across cultural norms, right? So culture, for example, in my country and in many countries around the world, is a much bigger limiter than religion. But the reality is the conversation's being had with or without you. I mean, you can point to what some people would think are the most progressive countries in the world in terms of religion. And they still have "In God We Trust" written on their money, and they still have reproductive rights that are fundamentally limited because of religion, and they still have conversations about the legitimacy of abortion and the legitimacy of a woman's right to her own body and the legitimacy of certain places of congregation in certain cities, So ultimately, our countries are dictated by those values and those norms, whether we like it or not. And those conversations are happening with or without us. I just think it's time we get in the room and get to actually start steering those conversations to be of our benefit instead of act against us.
Yeah. So moving on to talk a bit more specifically about your work, your organisation, Voice of Libyan Women, led the largest campaign in the country to combat the patronising narratives about women. How did you go about doing that and putting your message forward?
We used religion. So we started by using international conventions and CEDA and all of that, and we found that we kept getting the same women coming to the workshops. So women whose families were already supportive of their engagement, and we noticed quite early on that wasn't necessarily what we wanted. I wanted it to be a wider social change. And in order to do that, we had to talk to people locally and say, okay, so what is it that is preventing your daughter or your wife or you from engaging? And a lot of women would be very blunt with us and say, listen, it's good for you, but I don't want to go to hell. Which made me realize that God is very difficult to beat in a private debate that people are having in their heads. And so it became about really looking at their interpretation of those norms and challenging those. And so taking the same verses and the same quotes that had been used to tell them that they should not be leaders, to tell them that they should not take on political roles or roles of economic strength or education, etc., and say the exact opposite. So we focused predominantly on violence against women in the beginning. So that was the Noor campaign, and Noor in Arabic means, Noor in English means the Enlightenment. And the idea was to just really reinterpret or highlight what we felt was a proper interpretation of those verses.
So just touching on violence against women there, where do you think that problem specifically stems from?
Oh, I think it stems from the fact that we live in a very patriarchal society, and there has been the assumption since the beginning of time that women's bodies are public property, not their own, right? I think fundamentally, almost any issue you can talk about when it comes to women's personal space, health, comfort, etc., is because we have not been taught to value women as their own individual beings and their bodies as their own property. A lot of that stems from culture, some of it stems from religious interpretation, some of it stems from a lack of women's, clear political and economic leadership or control over the past centuries. But the reality is, it's something we see every day in our laws and in our businesses and our schools. And one of the challenges, I think, when it comes to violence against women is it's perceived to be a very personal problem, a private problem. So a lot of people don't want to talk about it. They're willing to talk about women's engagement in politics, but they don't want to talk about violence against women. And I find that to be challenging because if a girl has felt violated, if a woman has felt violated in the beginning of her career, she's probably not going to stay long-term in that career. Or if she's being violated at home, if she's being abused at home, she's probably not going to have the desire or the confidence, etc., to go in and run for office. If a woman is being violated every day, day in and day out, in newspapers, etc., and articles because of her political aspirations, she's probably, there's a lot less likelihood that she's going to continue in that space long term. Or if a woman feels that violation, that her body can be violated as a byproduct of her engaging in a particular career or a particular space, she's probably not going to want to engage in that space, right? So they go hand in hand. And if we're not talking about women's security and their right to self, then it's much more difficult to talk about women as leaders in politics, economy, et cetera. We need to first start at the basics and say that you have the right to be safe and secure in your own space.
So if the kind of idea of the patriarchy is so entrenched within societal norms across the world, how do you think we can combat the problems that creates?
I could give you a very controversial answer here. Start a girls' army. No, listen, I think it's entrenched, and I think ultimately the only way you actually reverse it is by re-engaging and reshifting the institutions that it's propagated on, right? So, and we slowly see that happening. We do. A lot of that, there was this joke, and there's this phenomenal multimedia presentation about posters about feminism in the 1950s and 60s where it said, the man works and the woman works, but does the house work? And it showed like this dirty house and this woman working in, which I thought was quite comical because it is actually important. That was a significant shift when you do start having two-income households, when you do start having women who have a lot more economic control. You find that there's been a change in conversation about what that means, right? Socially, what does that mean? And I think the more we see that on a global level, the more that conversation will shift, and the more we're going to start talking about leadership and women's leadership in policy, women's leadership in security. I think there's a lot of avenues that we haven't tackled yet. Science and technology and innovation is one of them. But I do think that the conversation is shifting because the people who are holding it up are no longer the same people. You're having a lot more minorities, you're having a lot more women who are in positions of influence and power and financial control, and I think that's fundamental.
Do you think it's something we need to start with early, so in kind of primary education, and teach young children about the kind of shift in the norm?
I think we need to start early and teach kids about leadership.
Yeah.
I think we need to teach girls that they are leaders. There's that statistic, I think it's over 80% of girls think they can be president when they're 7 years old, and that goes down to less than 10% when they're teenagers. And there's something that's happening in those formative years that we're not talking about. And it's much more difficult to convince somebody who fundamentally believes and has been socialized to believe that they're not a leader, that they then are a leader, than it is to go to them in their formative years and say, you're a leader, you can do this, right? And so I think we need to start engaging in that space. And that's when women are most vulnerable. They're most vulnerable to violence. They're most vulnerable to any type of kind of personal illness. And so I think it's important for us to really engage and say, you're a leader, and to create ecosystems where those girls can then go and seek leadership out. I think more importantly than that, if we're talking about really dismantling the current system in which we engage, we also have to talk about masculinity, and we have to talk about the way we raise young boys. And the way we raise young boys to believe leadership, what leadership looks like, and the way we teach them a leader acts, and the way, because that's fundamentally important. We cannot realistically talk about women's rights and women's leadership if we're not also talking about how much our current system disenfranchises young men and in terms of seeking out their own expression and their own leadership. It's an equally important conversation.
So just sticking with the theme of leadership for a second, how do you feel about the idea of quotas to empower women?
I hate the term empower. I don't like the term empower women because I think it removes the agency that women have. I think women are fundamentally empowered. I think we just need to amplify and listen to them. I like quotas simply because empirically they're proven to succeed. And that does not necessarily mean in the long term you need to have them, but definitely in a time of nation building and in a time where there's a lot of cultural elimination or negation of women's roles and women's participation, having a quota enforces something that can then become a cultural norm. So based solely on the ground realities, I support quotas.
How do you feel about the kind of critics of quotas who are women themselves and criticise the kind of mechanism as they feel that it maybe puts them down in a sense that people look at them and they say that they've only got that position because they're a woman?
Yeah, but sometimes they only didn't get that position because they're a woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Yeah. Okay, moving on then. How do you think that kind of everyday people can get involved in the movement, and how do you think, like, what do you think the role is for men to play?
I think men have an incredibly important role. There's two parts to that answer. First and foremost, I think everybody gets involved just by checking how they treat people in their own life, right? And how they communicate with the women in their own life, how they communicate with themselves, what kind of language they use, how respectful they're being in their own space, how much they reinforce some of those norms in their workplace or in their school. So if you notice that on your school board you have 7 men and 1 woman, then it's probably time for a lot of people to stand up and say, hey, I think we need more inclusive representation. And it's not just about we have 1 woman, but it's also about, are we being respectful of all the different minorities, the different communities? Because life experiences play a very important role in the experiences you bring to the table when you're looking at strategy or policy or discussions. So that's where I would start. I would always start first and foremost with yourself. I think it's very disingenuous to book a flight to like Libya or Zimbabwe and be like, I'm here to help the women, when you haven't necessarily done that in your own life. The second thing for men's involvement, I don't say it lightly, but I know for a fact I would not be here if it weren't for 2 people. My mom, who from a very young age, because she didn't do it, made it clear that education was the priority, that that kind of personal control and accountability was the priority. And the second would be my dad. And I think more so when it comes, and it's a sad reality, but there have been in meetings, I've been in meetings where a male colleague will say the same thing I said, literally the same thing, usually not as intelligently, and more people will agree with him. And so, but it's an important reality of our society that there are times, especially in this conversation, where men's voices are heard with a lot more volume. I mean, if I ask you to name the most well-known feminists in the world, you'll probably name the men that everybody puts on the front pages because they're the feminist of the year, et cetera, right? Or who are the most well-known political feminists, and you'll name men for me. And that's fair. But that also comes with a certain amount of responsibility. So if you are in a very masculine-dominated society, and a lot of that is dictated, and the UK is one, the US is one, Canada is one, Libya is one, I can't think of a single country that isn't, then I think it's your responsibility to start saying, okay, so whose voice can I amplify? If I'm in a meeting with you and you say something intelligent, rather than repeat the same thing, say, you know what, she had a great idea. That's a fantastic idea, and explore how I think you can also be an ally in that regard. The last thing I would say on it is, it does not take, it was based on even some women disagree with quotas. We cannot underestimate the power of of internalized misogyny. We can't, and I think we have to be cognizant that you are going to have women who disagree with you, you're going to have men who disagree with you, etc. But you have to come prepared for that conversation and for that debate at times. And so if you're going to start talking about women's inclusion in policy or in security, then come with the facts. Aside from the fact that, yes, we should not have to debate it, but you will have to. And so what are why are they so fundamentally important? Why do we need to have women at the table? What are the key aspects or traits or realities that they bring to the table? Be prepared for that, because not only will you convert some people along the way, but it also gives a lot more strength to the discussion.
Fantastic. Okay, I think now's probably the perfect time to open up some questions from the audience.
But only easy questions, because it's Monday night.
So if you've got a question, if you raise your hand and we'll try and get a microphone over to you. I see a hand's gone up straight away over there.
Hi, perhaps a bit of a specific question. I'm sorry if it's not an easy one.
What's your name?
Sufyan. In terms of those of us watching Libya, in terms of constitutional rights and maybe at some point legislative goals, what kind of thing should we be looking out for as things we should support it for women?
I think first and foremost, before you even get to the engagement of women, you're just going to have to get to a legitimate engagement of people, right? That's apparently that was funny to a few people, but no, you will. You're going to. It has to be a much more inclusive process, I think, and it has to be a people-led process, and that hasn't yet happened. And so I think that's the single greatest challenge, because anything, a lot of things, and we've seen it in countries around the world where something is written top-down. And because it has not been created and cultivated and agreed on by society, it doesn't translate into actual implementation. And that's the biggest challenge when it comes to women's rights. You have some of the best constitutions in the world in some of the countries that have the worst histories on women's engagement and the worst realities on women's engagement and women's rights. So to me, it's really important that it is locally led, that people have said, these are our goals, and you can then work towards something that's more implementable and more tangible. But having something that's aspirational with no resource and no implementation behind it is devastating for a country, because the reality of rewriting that constitution down the line is minimal unless there's re-engaged conflict, right? So for me, it's important to have, even if it takes longer, have a comprehensive, legitimate strategy where you have engaged with women, with people on the ground, and said, what is it that you need in this document? Having anything that's written top down just for the illusion of nation building and peace is I think the biggest mistake we can make.
Thank you.
I see a hand go up right there.
Thanks. You quoted some statistics earlier that showed correlations between better representation of women and other positive factors, so more women in government and less corruption. But how can you work out which one of those factors leads to the other? So does better gender equality lead to less corruption, or the other way around?
That's a very good question. I think you should research it. Yeah. So we haven't been able to figure, no, but it's a wonderful question. What we have seen is that when more women are engaged, corruption does decrease. But we don't know. A lot of people say, well, maybe if there's only one woman in a board of 30, she's a lot more cautious of her spending or of her audits, et cetera, right? So it's a very fair question. We don't know. But it all points in the same direction, and that's when you have more inclusive processes. When you don't have the 1% of the 1% in charge of the 99%, it's better any way you look at it, right? Which is the reason I wouldn't go around to a room and say, listen, we need 90% women and 10% men, because you are going to face significant challenges that way. It's about inclusion. It's about having enough diverse voices at the table that they're all responsive for their constituents, not for the body that they are a part of, right? That's the important relationship. But you should research that. I think that's a really good assignment for you. Good job. You're welcome.
I'm just over here at the front.
You've been talking about when you had the education as a woman and then you need to be amplified. But obviously you thanked your mom and dad. I don't think they amplified your voice to international agencies, your NGO, your work with the UN. How would you say, did you get past that threshold of education towards being heard and actively discussing these topics that are on the floor?
See, I would disagree with you. They did amplify me a lot. I come from a very conservative city in Libya. And my parents being so vocally supportive ensured that the rest of the community wouldn't have almost a, when people show up to your party and they're looking for a reason to dislike it, right? So it ensured that people didn't have that reason to dislike what I was saying. They couldn't say, oh, even her own parents don't support her, because that would have cut me off at the knees before I even started, right? So I did come from a society where my parents being vocally supportive was important in terms of just credibility locally. That being said, it was also important when I started going up to my parents and saying, hey, I'm going to go to the hotel and wait for the UN, and I'm going to force them to listen to me. My dad was the one who took me to that hotel. He dropped me off, right? And so I will never downplay the amount of, I had very little confidence in my ability to, I knew what I was saying, but I had little confidence in my ability to engage others until my parents said, no, you make sense. You should say this. And that was important. And I don't downplay the importance of community and of the people who will, especially for young women, of the people who will build your confidence, because you might know everything you need to know and you might just feel like you're not the person to say it. And you do need those to lift you up. If you don't have that, you can still do it, obviously. For me, it came down to, no, the UN had not been coming to my city. I did not live in the capital. And so I went to the hotel they were staying at. I waited until I saw a group of white men in suits, the UN, they were having lunch, and I introduced myself and I sat with them for lunch. And I explained what my project was, I explained what my work was, and from there that's how I met them. That's how I entered this space. And it was simply because nobody told me I couldn't. I did not know enough about the space to be told that I could not go. In later years, people were like, why would you do that? And I was like, it worked, didn't it? Like, I feel like this was a fine, but I had done the same thing I would do in almost any other space. If I felt like I wasn't being heard, I would just go and seek out whoever was in charge and make sure they knew I was there. So, and I think that's what it comes down to, is we need to be able to tell young women and young men who have ideas, who are leading organizations, who are doing the work, that there's no kind of like breakneck at that corridor of power, and you can go and speak to whoever you want, because at the end of the day, you're the one transforming your society. They're there as a service to you. They're there as a benefit to you. And if they're not doing that job well, it's your responsibility to tell them. I mean, at the end of the day, Libya's my country, right? And if what the UN was doing was upsetting me and wasn't sufficient, nobody would be better voiced to tell them than me.
I see a hand in the aisle just there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Adil. I'm from Canada as well.
Oh, cool. From where?
Toronto.
Oh, that's not Canada. No. Okay. That's okay.
Where are you from?
You're one of the big city folks.
Oh.
I'm from the prairies, from Saskatoon. Okay. Yeah, I'm a real Canadian.
I will concede you on that.
I'm just kidding.
It's not very common that we see physicians in prominent advocacy roles, especially outside of non-clinical institutions. And I was curious to know, what role does medicine play in fulfilling your aspirations for improving the world?
That's a wonderful question. Of course a Canadian would ask it. I actually think medicine has taught me a lot about the way I look at the world, and the way I look at problems, and why I think my engagement in policy has been unique, I would say, and why I am in the positions I'm in, is because I remember the very first meeting I was in. A lot of people who work in policy have been trained in policy, right? They've either gone to law or governance, et cetera, and they have a very kind of different way of looking at things, whereas in medicine, and this is an example I give often, but if a patient comes in with an infection, a deep infection in their arm, what would you do as a doctor? No doctors can answer this question. But what would you do? Okay. What would you do? Okay, so I'm glad you're not in medical school. But what would you do?
Treat it first.
How would you treat it? That's what I'm asking.
Talk to the patient first.
Okay, so you've talked to the patient, you've taken a proper history. What would you do next?
Antibiotics.
Antibiotics, okay. So you treat the system. What else would you do? If it's a deep infection, what do you do? Google. I'm not going to lie. I feel like a lot of doctors would do that, yes. There'd be a little bit of WebMDing in the bathroom before rounds. No, but you would debride it, right? You would debride it. You would clean it. And debriding is painful. It's more time consuming. It's more expensive. But you would clean it to the point where there is nothing left. Because what happens if you don't? Infection grows. And what happens to the arm? You amputate it, right? So what you do in that case is you do what is difficult, what is time consuming, what is expensive, what is comprehensive to prevent a total loss. That's medicine in a nutshell, right? It's also the reality that the patient gets to decide. So if you go up to a patient, you say, this is the treatment that's best for you, this makes sense, and they say, I don't want the treatment. You can't say, well, no, we have some boxes to fill, and I have some constituents that need you to, you can't do that. They get to decide. And what we fail in policy is, first off, we don't go to the root problem. We do not debride. We do not do the difficult, expensive, time-consuming art of looking at root problems and trying to fix them systemically. We try to cover it up with a Band-Aid and hope we won't have to amputate the arm. And the second thing we don't do is we do not listen to the local community at all. We make decisions in Brussels, London, New York, Washington, etc. Then we swoop in and we say, this is what we're going to do because this is better for you guys. And I think medicine can teach so much to policymakers about what it means to be in service of others. I think that is the gift that medicine has. And that's how I've used it in my own work. It's why, along with two colleagues, we started an institute called the Omnis Institute, which focuses predominantly on local leadership and on mentorship and how we can first and foremost mentor young men and young women, particularly young minority women, to be in positions of power and positions of influence where they can then bring those diverse voices to the table, but also how we can amplify local leaders in their communities so that they get to dictate what kind of treatment, where, when, etc. Because that's the most important part, right?
Great. See, a hand's got up just over there. Yeah.
Hi. So you said that you kind of got where you are because no one sort of told you that you couldn't do it. So assuming that as women, it's sort of boys from a young age kind of telling us we can't do it, how do you advise that we sort of combat this issue, not just in the UK, but sort of globally?
I think what taught me that I couldn't do it was, in part, the way I was raised. I joke sometimes that I was raised like a middle-aged white man. Depending on the audience, some people think that's funny, some don't. But I was never told I could not do anything. The one rule in my house was you got to work hard and you'll get there. So I remember at one point when I came home and told my mom I wanted to go to the moon, she was like, "Great, I'll pack your lunch." Like, you know. And that was just the way I was raised. And so I don't know if I can fairly answer that question because I never had to. As I've gotten older and in the space that I work in now, where I'm 20, 30 years younger than anybody else, I get severe impostor syndrome sometimes where I'll walk into a room and be like, should I even be here? And I remember the first meeting I ever went to at the UN, they gave me this really fancy nameplate. It was like wood, and they etched my name out in white. And I got to sit at the big table, and I thought I was so fancy. I was sitting there taking selfies on my Samsung flip phone back in the day. And I was very excited about it. And one of the young interns around my age came in and she said, excuse me, but that's Dr. Murabit's seat. And I hear he's quite difficult. Half of that is quite true. No, I'm kidding. But she said, you should go sit in the back with the other interns. And I don't know how many of you have been in this position where, when you're having an argument with somebody and you end up thinking of all the things you could have responded. So you're on your way home, you're like, I should have said this. I'm going to say this to her next time. So I'm walking. I don't know why I did it, but I picked up my things and I walked to the back where the interns sit. And the whole way, the whole time I was sitting there for about 10 minutes while other people were walking in, I was like, I'm going to say this to her. I'm going to show her who's boss. And until my male colleagues, predominantly male colleagues, came in and said, why are you sitting back there? Come sit in your seat. And it was the first of a couple of big times in my mind that I remember feeling wow, am I supposed to be here? Why, what am I doing here? I'm not qualified to be here. And throughout the entirety of this was my first big meeting. I had read for days beforehand. I was so prepared. I don't remember a single thing we discussed because the whole time I was sitting there thinking I'm going to say this to her and I'm going to prove to them and I'm going to prove to them that I should be here. And it took me that meeting, that 2 hours, and I think it's the grace of the universe that I had those 2 hours, because I was looking around the room and I noticed that other than me, there was not a single woman around the table. And it made me realize that this young lady had I mean, she definitely should have done her research, should have, but she was going based on what the environment had told her was the norm, right? And so it was a much bigger problem than just one intern. It wasn't going to change if I went and told her who was boss. So that was actually the day I decided I would start my mentorship program. That was the day, because I felt like if I had been able to make it to the position I had, if I had the amount of experience and know-how and knowledge and I felt out of place, imagine other people. So for me, that was a big wake-up call. It was the first time I felt really disempowered. And I felt like I had one of two things I could do. I could continue to cower and feel like I wasn't qualified, or I could engage and say, we need more people who look like me in the room so that this is a norm. And I think that's the first step. I think if you're young, seek out a mentor, seek out somebody who you admire in your field and say, I would like to be in the spaces you're in. I would like to see what it looks like, because then when you're in that space yourself, even before you're in that space, it won't feel so daunting. And when you're in that space, you'll know how to maneuver it, and you'll have a support system you've engaged. And once you're in that space, you then have the responsibility to reach out and to mentor others and to ensure that they can then come through the doors you've opened. That's the only way we can transform the system so that they're more inclusive, and so that when you walk into a room, it doesn't feel so overwhelming. You don't feel like you can't do it because you don't see anybody else who looks or sounds like you.
Okay, should we go to the hand just at the front over here? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Anna, and on that question, do you have any role models? And perhaps women or people from your country, and if so, why? Apart from your parents, of course.
Apart from my parents. Well, you took my only answer. No. My oldest sister is a badass. She's a pediatric plastic surgeon. Listen, when I was younger, here's an honest answer. When I was younger, role models were always very distant people. They were always like heads of state. They were always like, at one point, I remember my role models were, and this is very fair, Nancy Drew, very fair, very fair. But your role models are people you don't know when you're young. And as I've gotten older, and I would say especially my early mid-20s taught me that my role models, the ones who actually have shaped me, are the ones who are the closest to me. Those are the role models who have given me a lot of courage, and they're the ones I go to when I feel very confused or messed up, etc. And so it's great to read a lot of these things online about phenomenal leaders. I mean, if I had to name some, Angela Merkel is a leader that I find quite interesting, and I think is a role model in many ways. And Benazir Bhutto is another, and Malala is another, right? And you can read wonderful things about them and see the work they've done. But at the end of the day, when you get to actually be in the presence of people who every day combat the same things you combat, and every day come out on top and have succeeded in that space, even if it's, as something as like a stay-at-home mom or a doctor or a minister or a student, right? That to me has been a lot more powerful in terms of how it's translated in my life. So I would say my oldest sister, and I have another my sisters and my brothers have been great role models, and and my parents. I'm sorry, I'm going to use that answer. And my niece and nephew teach me a lot. They're 3 and they're 4, and they teach me a lot about the world. So they've been good role models.
Okay, should we go to the hand just at the back there? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. So you've talked about how men can be allies to women, but how can women be allies to each other within the feminist movement, and in terms of intersectionality, how can more privileged women be allies to less privileged women?
I think it's actually the same answer. I think it's recognizing your privilege and saying, okay, this is not a space I need to be in, or I need to be able to open the door for somebody else. Recently, I was... my 2 colleagues here went through this experience with me. Recently, I was asked to speak at an event at a university in the States and receive an award. And when I saw the poster, I noticed that the poster did not have any African American women on it. in a particular which I thought was exceptionally important, not only because of the state, which is heavily African American, but also because of the history of African American women in the U.S. and what they've done and the leadership that they've provided. And so it became my responsibility as one of the speakers to go to the organizers and say, if she's not going to speak, then I won't speak, right? And I think what we need to be able to do is do that more entirely. I hold a certain amount of privilege. I am very thankful for it. I recognize I've worked very hard for it, but it's now my opportunity and it's my responsibility to be able to use that privilege to ensure that other people get into that space. And that's what the mentorship program is really key for. The same way I would expect the same of other women. And I think we need to make that a norm. That's the best answer I think I can give, is if we're not giving up space ourselves, then and realistically, I mean, it's very difficult for me to go into a room knowing that I've taken up somebody else's space and say to men in the room, well, you're taking up our space. I mean, it's very disingenuous. So I think we do have to always start in our own actions and see, is there something that you're doing where you're taking up space of somebody else whose voice needs to be heard? How is there a way for you to amplify the voices of others? Is there a way for you to shift this conversation to ensure that more people are included? And if you've done that, if you've done your due diligence, then I think always vocalizing that in every meeting you can, saying, listen, it would be really great if we could have the voice of, X person. If you're talking about local policies, it would be really great if we could have more inclusive voices, and making sure that's always the first thing on people's minds, I think, is very important. But that being said, the one thing I will say about allyship and everything we're talking about, women's rights or allies or everything we're talking about ultimately is about power. Right? We're talking about power dynamics. We're talking about the fact that in order for somebody else to get some power, people are going to have to give up some. That's a reality. And there's I mean, if you look at kind of different political theories, et cetera, it's very true that once more people get to the table doesn't necessarily mean that you get less, but the table widens. That's true. But in the very beginning, it takes a lot of courage for people to invite others to the table in the first place. So it comes down to power. How will you leverage your personal power to ensure that other people get access to their own personal power? That's what it comes down to.
Okay, I think we've maybe got time for one last question. Let's see, a hand went up right.
Well, why don't we just take them and then I can answer them at once.
Yeah, sure. So we'll go to the back first and then to the front. So just further forward, it was over here. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Michael. So you've spoken about leadership quite a lot today, so I'd like to know what you think makes an effective leader.
Okay. What's the second question?
Hi, I was wondering if in your role of leadership you were always aware of being a woman. And I'll kind of take the example of Nicki Minaj, who kind of started off as a female rapper, but for a lot of people has just become a rapper now, as opposed to just always having this identity of a woman with her, which obviously is a very important identity in what you do. But even in other stuff, like in global health, for example, do you feel like the identity of a woman is always important, or do you sometimes just think of it as a leader in global health?
Okay, and there was one last question down back there.
Hi, thank you for taking the last question. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you feel religion inspires you in terms of doing things for women's rights, and does it mean that you have a slightly different perspective on women's rights, or would you say that talking about it in a religious context and a secular context is pretty much the same, just maybe, what's the difference for you, or is there any difference between these two contexts?
Cool. So the first question, what makes an effective leader? I think courage. I think the courage to make the right decisions, not to succumb to the lowest common denominator. But I think across the board, every great leader that I admire has been infinitely courageous to make the decisions that were necessary, regardless of personal risk or so courage, I think, would be the first thing. Especially now, I think it's very difficult to be courageous in your truth. And so for me, that would be fundamentally important. Also, the ability to know when you don't know. I think that is a lost art. And I mean, I think the smartest leaders have surrounded themselves by people where they can say, you know what, that's not my area of expertise, but I have somebody who does know. And I think that's very powerful. So that would be my answer for that one. The second question, did I ever forget I was a woman? I don't think anybody in the room ever forgot I was a woman, so I sure did not. I don't know how many of you watch Game of Thrones, but there's that scene. I'm rewatching the first season because my partner has not watched it yet, but which is another problem. But but there's a scene in the first season where Tyrion says to Jon Snow, "Don't ever forget what you are, because nobody else does," right? And so I walk into every situation very well aware that everybody in that room, and even, when I was 21, a very close mentor of mine told me, you have 4 things working against you: your gender, your religion, your ethnicity, and your age. And you're lucky you'll grow out of your age. But you're unlucky because when you get very old, we don't listen to the women anyways. Which was interesting to me. And I walk into a room knowing that a lot of people have misconceptions about those 4 things, and I have to work against them regardless of any situation I'm in, right? That being said, I think it's an incredible amount of power. I do. I think when you walk into a room, and it's the same thing I say to almost every young woman I work with, when you walk into a room and the vast majority of people in that room do not have the same experience as you, do not get to hear from the same voices you get to hear from, do not have the same constituents, do you know how much power you have in shaping legitimate, practical, implementable strategies? That's what makes you successful. So never forget what makes you what you are. I don't think anybody should forget it. I think you should leverage it. I think you say, listen, if I was raised in a less affluent neighborhood, if I am Arab, if I am Muslim, if I am a woman, if I am, a young Bangladeshi man, if I got to go to Oxford, leverage every single experience you've had. Use it. Because when you walk into a room, the vast majority of people in that space, particularly when it comes to policy, even global health, don't have those same experiences. And you get to be the voice of reason oftentimes, or the voice of innovative strategy that they don't get to be. So always leverage it. Never, I don't think anybody should ever forget. And for religion, for women's rights in a religious or a secular, for me they're the same. They're one and the same. I think my religion has taught me that women as human beings deserve to be respected, to have roles of leadership, to have roles of power, to have roles of influence. That's what my faith has taught me, and it's only been kind of validated by research and empirical evidence and all of that. But that's something that I've always fundamentally believed, and I continue to believe. For me, I think if we start painting them as 2 different things, it makes the conversation a lot more difficult. The reality is that they are one and the same. And that what we need to do, I think, as a global community is to combat a lot of the misogynistic interpretations of women's rights that are embedded in every faith, that are embedded in every culture. And when we paint it as a one culture or a one religion type thing, it's a lot more difficult to tackle the root of the problem. And I think we need to be a lot more united in that conversation.
So unfortunately that's all we've got time for today, but if everyone could please join me in saying a huge thank you to Dr. Murabit for joining us.